Well, good morning. I am Susumula Shoyinka. I'm a psychiatrist and the host of Mind, Heart, and Spirit Mental Wellness. This is a podcast dedicated to exploring all aspects of mental health. And today we're joined by Miss Veronica Long, an extremely talented young woman who has courageously volunteered to share her story with us. If you've ever wondered about conditions like ADHD, Miss Long's experience is an interesting illustrative journey. Welcome, Veronica. It's great to have you here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shoinka. I appreciate you making the time.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us and being willing to share your story with our audience. So, just by way of introduction, could you tell the audience about yourself and your connection with mental health and how this conversation has come about?
Sure. So, I am currently a master's in health administration student at the University of Missouri in Columbia. I got my bachelor's degree there as well. I got an emphasis in leadership and policy. I have always been interested in anything health related at all. I decided that I wanted to do something health related from a really early age because I was born with a congenital disorder that affected my kidneys and made me really sick. So I grew up essentially in the medical field. The doctor's office or the hospital was essentially my second home. So I always knew that I wanted to do something related to health. I decided I wanted to go the administration route after sort of experimenting with a couple of different positions between my bachelor's and my master's degree. So my journey started from the time I was a child, had a couple of different instances of anxiety, depression, starting very young. Anything that could be related to mental health is something that I've had to, in part, learn because of the experiences that I've had, experiences that other people have had, and just my genuine interest in it. Taking abnormal psychology in college, for example. So, kind of giving you a little bit of background there. Your and I connection came about through my project management professor in my master's program. So, I've had the privilege of getting to work as a contracted project manager for you, where I've got to learn even more about all things mental health.
And it has been a real pleasure working with you, Veronica. Your skills are exceptional and multifaceted, and we'll get into some of that background during the discussion. But I want to thank you because our work has truly been impacted in a very positive direction by your involvement in it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It's
Yeah,
been really fun.
well, that's good. We didn't traumatize you. That's always a good place.
Not
That's a
yet.
good, that's a good place to start. So, um, earlier in those introductory remarks, you talked a little bit about your history, an early experience with various mental health symptoms, let's say. Could you, and how that may have been rooted in your medical diagnoses and having to seek medical attention in such an intensive way very early on in life? Just kind of walk us through that experience.
Sure. So, with having a congenital disorder related to my kidneys, I was sick a lot. I will say I call it being shielded from the actual gravity of the situation. And my parents did a really good job of hiding how nervous they were. But I was sick a lot, fainting a lot. My hair wasn't growing very fast. My teeth were not falling out at the same time that everyone else's were. My nails were brittle. I was often pale. So we were having a lot of issues. And I will say that the experiences were overall positive when it came to working with medical professionals or being worked on by medical professionals, but I don't know how related or unrelated it could be. But the first time I ever experienced anxiety, I was about 6 years old. And of course, as a 6 year old in what was that, 2002, I did not know what anxiety was. I didn't know what it felt like. I just knew that what I was feeling was not comfortable, it wasn't fun, and it caused me a lot of stress. I started having very lucid nightmares around that time. They've come and gone here and there, but that was the first experience. The first experience I ever had of ADHD, again, of course, not knowing what it was when I was in early grade school. So on our report cards, instead of having just your grades, they would also have a behavioral category. And I would have all A's, and my behavioral category would have a D. And the D wasn't in an A, B, C, D. D stood for distraction to class. So that was something that started off very early. I was a really friendly kid. So anytime that they would move me around the classroom, I would still end up talking and making friends. But as I said, I was getting good grades. So that sort of thing was maybe not ignored, but maybe masked by some of the other things. So those were the first of the anxiety and the ADHD. But I didn't actually get diagnosed with ADHD until I was around 26.
Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I imagine I can just think of a lifetime of dealing with a condition basically that affects a fundamental capability, which is just being able to sit down and concentrate and plan your tasks and work through without getting distracted. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. But let me first of all tie together a few threads. So you talked about the medical challenges that you had early on. And I think one of the things I have learned in my career, I've been a psychiatrist now, if you include my experience outside of the US, it's about 24 years now.
Hmm.
Within the US, it's 16 years outside of training.
Hmm.
Now, one of the things I've learned is how very often those connections are missed. How medical conditions and sometimes even treatment of medical conditions can trigger psychiatric symptoms. Although, of course, as you rightly pointed out, we don't know that that was the case with you. The other thread I want to draw out is people think of mental health conditions as it's really not recognized how early they start, especially things like anxiety. You can almost always trace the threads back to early life, preteen, in fact. And also the fact, as you mentioned, that it's oftentimes not recognized, especially in girls and women, because it looks very different. It's not externalized, it's very much internalized, where it's harder to recognize. And kids often don't have the language to describe it. So let's go back and pick up on your experience as a 6-year-old
Yeah.
with anxiety. Describe what that was like. You talked about nightmares, and then you kind of segued to the ADHD symptoms. But
Hmm.
bring us into your experience as a 6-year-old. What that was like for you?
Yeah. I would say I had stranger danger where I was not interested in speaking to even the person at the cash register at the Myers we would go to when I lived in Michigan. I hated having babysitters. I wanted to hide from them. I would have nightmares about being kidnapped often. I mean, I'm talking about when I was, in kindergarten, in first grade. I think that some of that might have also come from being that I was almost 6 years old when 9/11 happened.
Hmm.
And I was actually at school, and I distinctly remember the teacher coming in, and God bless her. I don't think she realized what she was kind of saying to us, but I still think about it 20 plus years later. She came in and said, "Something very bad has happened to America, and you all need to go home." And of course, as a, like I said, 5 or 6 year old, we didn't really have a concept of what that was. But I was like, what's going on here? We go home and then clicking on the channels, going through trying to find cartoons. It was gray smoke. It was helicopters. It was people scared, politicians, being very tense. So again, I can't necessarily say that that was a part of it, but I was afraid of another 9/11 happening when I was a little kid. That was something that really stuck with me. Other things to think of, I mean, I was even scared of sleeping over at people's houses. My mom was definitely my rock when it came to assuaging my fears. She definitely helped me a lot. But yeah, I was basically scared of everything and everyone when I was a little kid. So that translated into me being very quiet until I felt a bit more comfortable. And then, like I said, I became a distraction to class.
Wow. And you mentioned your mom and how she was extremely supportive. Was there any recognition? And obviously, no, this is not a criticism, but was
Sure.
there any recognition or any sort of awareness at the time? I mean, we're talking 20 plus years ago when mental health was not even, it wasn't in the public view as it is now.
Right.
Was there any sort of awareness at the time that this could be anxiety? This was something treatable as far as you can tell?
No, no, and I think if you were to ever speak to my mom, she would tell you that she probably has been experiencing anxiety her entire life too. So, it's difficult for someone to recognize that in their kid if they haven't been diagnosed with it themselves, or if they grew up in a time where anxiety was just considered anxiousness. It was just considered nervousness. So I know when it came to anxiety, I don't remember a recognition of it, of a verbal recognition of it until I was much older. Again, that might have been her shielding me from any sort of additional fears that could come with that. Because I think we all know that there is a stigma that still exists, but certainly in the early 2000s or early 2010s, where you have a fear of a label from the diagnosis. But I
Yes.
remember that it was a common thing where people would think that little kids are energetic, little kids are rambunctious. They want to run around, they want to climb trees, they have an outburst in class because they've got a lot of energy because they're Energizer bunnies. So I remember some people would say that kids that were on ADHD medications were zombie like. So I think some people still believed that kids that had ADHD, to put it very bluntly, had quote unquote lazy parents. They weren't parents that were strict enough or could control them enough. And that's where those outbursts and the distractions came from, not because of anything neurologically or chemically imbalanced.
Wow, that's a lot. So ADHD and anxiety and dealing with the national trauma of 9/11 at the time. And wow, okay. So bring us on further along your journey.
The first time I think that I ever probably experienced symptoms of depression was around 12 years old. I was a pretty rambunctious kid. I had a nickname where my parents would call me Billy Goat because I liked to climb trees. I loved being outside, running around. I would play soccer and do ballet on the same days. We call those Super Tuesdays when I'd be in school and then home pretty late at night. So I was a pretty energetic kid. But then around the time that I was 12, there was, I would say, a 6 month stint of me not wanting to get out of bed, not wanting to do anything that I used to be excited about or that used to bring me joy or happiness. Either was barely giving me that or wasn't giving me that at all. There's a lot of, I would say, preteen existential dread. But again, like I said, my mom was really supportive and she occasionally would just let me stay home. And just having that, what, we'll tell them you're sick today, or what, you can take this absence, come grocery shopping with me, even if it wasn't going to school, that was extremely helpful. And I was a punctual, hardworking student, so it's not like she was participating in truancy, but that was something that was really, really helpful for me. And then the first time I think I experienced an anxiety attack, I know that I had a couple in high school. I didn't actually know what they were, just kind of calling it that I was freaking out or something. I did have one in front of someone in college who was familiar with what anxiety attacks looked like. And they had recommended me very strongly that I needed to actually seek help. So I did. And I went to the appointment. The person that I saw was nice. She immediately diagnosed me with anxiety, but she didn't really dig in that much. She did prescribe me hydroxyzine, which once I looked it up, it was an anti itch medication. It also works for anxiety, but I think in my head that told me that she didn't actually take what I was saying seriously. And the couple of times that I did try to take it, it was the smallest dose available, so it did not work. And so I think my 19, 20-year-old mind just, I think I threw away the medication or at least let it expire, then threw it away. Didn't really trust that she was listening to me. She didn't try to dive into anything else. She was just focused on the anxiety because that's what I'd come in for and didn't really explore it. And so it took me many years after that to try to manage or to try to deal with my diagnosis, to try and manage my anxiety.
Wow, wow. Wow, you said so much there. Let me see if I can just pull those threads out. So let's just go back. So you first saw treatment in college at 19,
Mhm.
and you'd been experiencing anxiety, then ADHD symptoms, and then depression, a pretty significant episode of depression at 12.
Mhm.
So you went without treatment for 13 years, basically,
Yeah.
no
Yeah.
formal treatment. And then when you went to seek help, if I can paraphrase what I think I heard you say, your experience with the provider in the encounter turned you off, basically.
Yeah.
You did not find that the interaction satisfactory or therapeutic. You didn't feel heard or listened to, and you felt it was almost like a cursory, here, take this medication without really an explanation of, well, it is used for multiple purposes, like many psychiatric medications have
Right.
multiple uses, but there was no real education or attempt to educate you on that. And I think maybe something really poignant that you said there, there was no attempt to discover more about you as a person. What could be behind this? What else was going on in the background that could have contributed to this? Which then, again, paraphrasing you, left a bad taste in your mouth. So there was no real eagerness to continue with the recommendations.
Exactly. But to be fair, I never went back to that provider. There's always a possibility that if I had gone back, maybe we would have been able to dive into other things. But I did not go back after the first time. And I think that some of it came from me feeling ignored, but I think some of it also came from me being so nervous that she had immediately labeled me, because that's where my mind was at that time. It wasn't a diagnosis to help me figure out what I need to do and how I need to manage it. It felt like I was being labeled as, okay, now this is a person that has anxiety. This is a person who can't cope with daily stressors. And to me, it felt like by getting that label that I was somehow weak.
Or broken or flawed in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that stigma is such a problem because part of what stigma does, and you've illustrated that in your story, actually in what you just said, one of the things that stigma does is it discourages seeking help. And the way it does that is it distorts the perception of what it means to seek help. So, if I can just draw an analogy real quick, I think we've all gone to see primary care providers. You get 10 minutes with them. Right.
Unfortunately,
And the
yeah.
first visit, you may get 20 minutes if you're lucky. And you get to talk about one problem. And in that 10 minutes encounter, it's reviewing labs, it's, getting a history, usually not that much in depth. And at the end of the encounter, it's a treatment decision, it's a recommendation, which is oftentimes medication. Here, take this. Obviously, it's very different. I'm not drawing a false analogy here, but people are really not hesitant to go see a PCP. They see it as, oh, something is wrong. I want to take it in and get it fixed. With mental health, it's, what does this mean? What does this say about me?
Right.
What does that mean for my perception of myself? Somebody who's capable and just normal, regular person. It's all these connotations, and that's unfortunately what stigma does. But I also want to comment on the experience. I've heard it so many times now, as somebody who treats people, who helps people find their way through some of these conditions. It's really unfortunate that that's very often the experience of people is they find that their first encounters are suboptimal. They don't know what to expect. They go in and they feel disappointed. This person didn't take that much time with me. They didn't really take time to understand me, and I felt I got rushed out with this script. Of course, there is, I think, some responsibility on providers, but by and large, I will say most clinicians that I know want to help people. I mean, nobody goes into mental health really for the money.
Of course.
Yeah, but I think your points are well made that some combination of the way the treatment system is modeled leads to that experience for people. It's very unfortunate. So I'm sorry that happened to you, but and I'm curious to know in the years before you actually. So we'll go on with your story in a minute, but you had to have had to find some ways to cope with the anxiety and with the distractibility. How did you do that? What did you come up with?
So I will say I am a very organized person. I think you can attest to that when you look at the kind of work that I do for you.
Yes,
uh,
the most organized person.
so I think that is a part credit to, now that I'm properly medicated, but also partly credit to the stress that I had to endure. I remember the first thing I ever lost. I'm really good at leaving things. I mean, just the other day, I left my house key in Kansas City as I was driving back to my college campus, which is 2 hours away, and in sub freezing temperatures, had to wait for a maintenance man to come let me in. So it still happens to this day. But one of the first things I remember losing was a pair of earrings. They were clip on earrings because at the time I didn't have my ears pierced. They were my mom's and they were gorgeous. And I took them off because there was a pressure on my ears when I had finished my ballet recital. And I set them down on a table, completely forgot about them. When I went back to get them, when my mom said, "Where are my earrings?" they were gone. And someone had stolen them. I used to go to Lost and Found on a weekly basis when I was in middle school. I lose things all the time, very absent minded. So, having a very structured system is how I sort of coped with it. I mean, my sock drawer is both color coded and designed by level of height on the calf or ankle up to how thick they are. So, to give you an idea, because I'm so good at losing things, I have to be really good at organizing so that I know exactly where everything is supposed to go. So, that's one of those things that I will say that helped me with my ADHD. And I would say also with my anxiety, because those things are more of a Venn diagram, right? They're not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, yeah.
The frustration that you feel from losing something from your ADHD can give you anxiety. I think shame might be a common thread shared amongst all three of these conditions because you experience shame in not being able to stay on track or interrupting people. You can tell they're visibly annoyed because you're interrupting them. Shame in what you're doing or what you're saying or what you didn't say. Frustration that you didn't think of what to say at the time because you were distracted. Not feeling happy is something that, depression, you can feel a lot of shame for not feeling happy because people might be worried about you. So there's a lot of different things that can sort of intermingle between those three things. But I would say masking is the way that I sort of handled my depression, where I either tried to just kind of bury it deep down and put a smile on my face, or I drank underage, so that was an outlet that wasn't a healthy one, but it was one that I had. And I'm not saying I was, drinking beer on the bus or something like that, but on the weekends we might go to a party and drink underage with wine or beer or something. And so that luckily wasn't something that has stuck with me, but it was something that was a way to experience that joy that you weren't experiencing when you were just baseline. So that sort of masked the depression or at least distracted you from it. And it would also make you more carefree. So I wasn't experiencing anxiety. But obviously, drinking alcohol underage is not only illegal, but it is very unhealthy. It's not good for you. And you're still developing, even as a, 17, 18-year old, which is around the time that I was, drinking on a random weekend. So all the coping mechanisms aren't healthy coping mechanisms is my point here.
And you're commenting on things that are so often reported, right? So the fact that and I want to bring us back into your experience of ADHD and your experience of depression in a minute. But to comment on some of the things you said, it's so often the case that when a young person or people in general are experiencing anxiety or depression, particularly pre treatment, or even sometimes in the early stages of treatment, because it does take a while to find the right treatment combination. It also takes a while for the treatment to actually kick in and start to work. People often reach for the next available or most easily, readily available tools to help to reduce the symptoms or contain the symptoms. So what's available? Legal substances. They are actually drugs. They're just packaged differently. So alcohol is very common. It's very commonly used to treat anxiety, particularly social anxiety. My very first CBT patient when I trained in the United Kingdom came in with comorbid social anxiety and alcohol use disorder, but he started drinking because he could not for the life of him relax at a party or any kind of social gatherings. So that's very common. It's also the case that, and increasingly nowadays, marijuana is being used as in some of the same ways. There's a whole conversation to be had around that, but they serve the same purpose. And I think the last point I want to make here is 2 points, is the duration of time between when people first experience symptoms and when they get treated sometimes can be as much as 2 decades, which is a lot of time to have to cope with so much distress. You mentioned sometimes these were the only ways that you could find some joy because your baseline was so It was such distress that was at that baseline. Okay. The last thing I will say is that is again your story illustrates the very consistent research finding that untreated, particularly in young people, but in every age bracket, untreated ADHD in particular, but untreated anxiety and depression also can funnel people as strongly linked to substance use, stimulants, or drugs of all kinds. So
Hmm.
thankfully, as you said, in your case, it didn't develop into a use disorder, thankfully, but in many people, it often does. And these conditions are very frequently comorbid. They happen at the same time, as you mentioned with the Venn diagram. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing what must have been a lot of emotional pain for a long time. You brought us early into your experience of anxiety. Bring us into what it's like to have ADHD and then what it's like to be depressed.
So, when it comes to ADHD, the easiest way that I can describe is just by giving you an example. So, let's say you are doing homework and you realize your water bottle is empty. So, you're going to go to the kitchen. You need to fill it up with your Brita. As soon as you open the fridge door to grab it, you realize you forgot to take any meat out for your dinner, right? You forgot to take the chicken out of the freezer. So, you grab that, you go to put it in the dish that you use to defrost the meat in the fridge, and you realize, oh, it's in the dishwasher. So then you go to open the dishwasher, you grab it, and you're like, why would I only take out one thing in the dishwasher? I might as well just go ahead and do all of that now. So as you're doing it, you remember, oh, hold on a second. I came in here not to do this, but to go fill my water bottle. So where's my water bottle? Oh, I left it in the room that I was doing my homework in. Okay. Now you go back into there, you grab your water bottle. On your way back to the kitchen, you notice that your laundry basket is full. You meant at the very beginning before you even started your homework to actually fill and start your washing machine. So seeing as though it's going to take a while to wash, you're like, you know what? Let me just set this water bottle down. I'm going to grab my laundry hamper. I'm going to start separating out my clothes. And as you're doing that, suddenly you hear your phone go off. You go into the kitchen, you check your phone. It's an important email that you need to reply to. So you go back to your computer where you're doing your homework to reply immediately. And when you open up your computer, you realize, oh, my unfinished homework, right? I was supposed to do that. And that's when then you're prompted to remember, oh, I was doing my homework, but then I was going to fill my water bottle. So then you grab it on your way. You still see that your laundry is half separated on the floor down the hall in front of your washing machine. But you're like, no, I'm going to go. I need to fill this. I need to go to the fridge and fill it. You go to the fridge. Once again, you're like, oh, that frozen meat that I was supposed to put into that dish that I was taking out from the dishwasher, it's in the sink, and it's only a half emptied dishwasher at this point. So all of a sudden you're frustrated. You're like, why can't I just fill my water bottle? What is wrong with me? You're embarrassed because maybe you have a roommate and you got back to doing your homework after filling your water bottle, and they come home and they see that your chores are half done. And then or you're thinking
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
decision paralysis.
yeah.
Yeah, like all of a sudden you're like, oh, I have decision paralysis. I don't know what I should do first, because you're internally you're still going, well, if I start the laundry, then by the time the laundry is done, I'll been able to have done everything else. But then you also realize you're very hungry and your dishwasher still isn't done. So should you cook in the kitchen until your dishwasher is fully out? Because what if you hit your foot on it? So it's just those sort of things where you look around and you have a thousand unfinished tasks, and hours have gone by, and you have, did I go through a wormhole? Right, it's that type of thing. That's the way that I would describe ADHD, and the frustration, the embarrassment, feeling overwhelmed. Then that's where your anxiety can kick in. So my anxiety is a physical feeling. It manifests in, all of a sudden it feels like my heart is starting to beat a lot faster. So then I'm having to take deeper breaths because I can tell that I'm automatically taking quicker breaths. I remember specifically around this time last year, I'd gotten an email and I read the email wrong. I thought I had done something wrong, that I hadn't paid my utility bill, or I can't even remember what it is at this point, which just goes to show you something I was super anxious about wasn't even something that mattered to me a year later. But I'd read the email wrong. And once I reread it, I was still experiencing those physical symptoms. And luckily, because I do yoga, I learned box breathing. So it's when you breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds. So I was practicing that. And I thought to myself, this is so silly. This is ridiculous. Like I read the email wrong. My anxiety should be going away. This physical response that I'm having to an external stimulus that was imagined, this shouldn't be happening. So it's a weird feeling. But I mean, you could worry about embarrassing yourself at a party or something that you said when, when you were at a happy hour with your coworkers that happened a year ago. Or maybe you're anxious about saying something silly at the happy hour with your coworkers a week from now. It's a weird feeling. Someone has described to me that depression is like focusing on the past and anxiety is focusing on the future. But I disagree. I think anxiety could go in the past or in the future and certainly in the present as well. But I do think that it can get you stuck in that. And the way that I would describe depression, as I said before, it's the same thing you sort of hear on commercials where you lose interest in things that used to interest you. You feel less joyful than before. If I were to look at a chart where it went from 0 to 100%, maybe 100%, this is your happy meter. I maybe am only hitting 50 or 60%. And I know that remaining 40 or 50% was something I was able to achieve before. And that almost makes you feel more depressed because you're like, why can't I experience this? I used to experience this. When am I ever going to experience this again? Will I ever experience true happiness again?
Dark place. Dark place. I'll say this to you and other people who live with these conditions. Depression is so common. Anxiety is so common. I mean, anxiety is the single commonest mental health condition globally, and the rates have gone up over the last several decades, particularly among young people. But what I was going to say was, I don't think people recognize how much fortitude, how much inner strength you have to just keep going, like living with a condition like one of these, particularly when it's untreated, and particularly,
Isn't
yeah.
that ironic that it takes a lot of strength when you yourself feel weak for having this?
Yeah, and the fact that it's tragic, really, it's a travesty that people with mental health conditions who have to recruit so much of their inner resources just to function are treated as being weaker or seen as being weaker. It's sad to think of it that way, but that's really the core of why we're doing this right now, is to help to dispel that stigma. So again, I appreciate your being candid. So we've come up to age 19. We've sort of seen your first attempt to get formal treatment. Bring us up the rest of the way.
Sure. 2018 was when I graduated from college. And I won't necessarily say that this was a bout of depression that was caused by any sort of chemical imbalance, but the first year after you graduate from college and you're working at a desk job, even though for half of that first year I was traveling for work, it was a very depressing time. You grow up, I would say, 5 years in that 1 year of going from being 22 and having fun in school, going to classes, living either with your friends or 5 minutes from your friends, to working day in and day out. One thing I really enjoyed in the summers is going to the pool with my friends. And there would be times where I'd be sitting at my desk just staring outside at the sun, just thinking, oh, I could be at the pool hanging out with my friends right now. So that was I don't think necessarily a piece of depression coming from a mental condition, but more so of just, this is my new role. And so some of the depression can stem from that. But about a year after I had graduated, so this was July of 2019, my older brother passed away. So I only have one sibling, my older brother, Marshall. And so when that happened, it felt like the entire world stopped. I had just started a new job about a month before he had passed away. I had just seen him, I think, a week or two before he had passed away, and it was sudden. He was 25, I was 23, and it completely rocked my world because he is my best friend. So that was something that was extremely painful and just about impossible to endure. Any feeling of depression I had before then pales in comparison to what I experienced losing my big brother, my guardian, my best friend. So I finally decided at that point, I need to see a therapist or a grief counselor. I need help. I can't do this anymore. This coping that I'm doing, this having fun on the weekends, I don't want to go outside. I don't want to leave my house. I had to force myself to even just take care of myself by feeding myself, by brushing my teeth, by showering. All of those tasks were extremely difficult because of the anguish that I was feeling, the physical pain that I was feeling from this heartbreak. So I finally was able to seek counseling and I saw a grief counselor, I want to say within a month, if not within 2 months of my brother passing away. And that was extremely helpful. I am so happy that I did not have to. It's not called doctor shopping, but sometimes people have to switch from therapist to therapist because maybe their first one or even their second one doesn't quite fit. I was very lucky that the grief counselor that I was seeing in Kansas City was really effective, very kind, and helped me really process what I was going through. And we did talk about that, but there was almost times where I was feeling frustrated because all I did was want to talk about Marshall, but he really wanted to get that background. And I remember when he would ask me questions, I'd think in my head, what does this have to do with my brother? But he was really peeling back the layers to help me figure out what else was going on. I think in a way to help me get coping strategies or figure out strategies to help me process my grief. So it was very, very helpful. And he was not a psychiatrist, so he couldn't prescribe me medication, but he got me connected with a psychiatric nurse practitioner, and she was wonderful. She recommended that I take a genomic test to see which medications might be a good fit for me. Obviously, I know genomic testing isn't perfect, but I did not want to go through the process of having to try out different antidepressants for a month or two or three or four to see which one worked. I needed something that worked immediately. I had had many friends that I spoke to about their experiences. I loved Lexapro. I hated Lexapro. I loved Zoloft. I hated Zoloft. I liked Alprazolam. I hated Alprazolam. There was all these different things I was hearing from different people, so I really couldn't take anyone's word for it. And so that's when I then got the genomic test, and the prescription that she had recommended worked very well.
First of all, it's very interesting to hear that and gratifying to hear that your second experience, your second exposure to getting treatment was a positive experience. And you mentioned something that I would say making its way into more consistent use in mental health, which is the idea, the genomic testing. It's basically a standard panel of matching the medications that are most commonly prescribed, basically a current formulary with a person's individual genetic profile, which can be day and night different. So your friends, I mean, obviously you're genetically very, very different. They may have a certain response to medication because of their genetic profile, and somebody else may have a very different outcome. It's very important, I think, and to your point, that's to broaden that. The bigger question is, or the bigger idea here is, I think when people think about mental health treatment, again, that historic stigma kicks in. I think the residue of what's still in people's mind is these barbaric treatments that historically had been applied to people, oftentimes forcibly against their will. So think about lobotomies, think about even the original ways that ECT, which is one of our most effective treatments, were administered. And people think mental health treatment, and what pops into their head is one flew over a cuckoo's nest. That's what comes into their head. Coercive treatment against my will. I'm going to be pinned down. These medications are going to zombify me. And unfortunately, it's not reflective of the current practice. Nowadays, treatment is much more precise. It's also much more, at its best, it's really a collaboration. It's a partnership. And it's also integrated with other providers. So good treatment looks like your providers are listening to you. First of all, they're tuned to your needs. You have space, you feel safe, you feel comforted just by being there. It feels safe. And it may be the first time for many people where they feel safe. But it's also collaborative. It's a partnership. You're working together to find what's best for you. So your nurse practitioner listen to you. I don't want to try all these different things. Let's find a way, a shortcut. And fortunately, the tools do exist to do that now. And the third thing that I want to pull out is your grief counselor recognized this is more than therapy. This needs medication and was able to connect you fairly quickly with somebody else who could get you the help you needed, which speaks to the question of access within mental health, which is such an issue for many reasons, which you won't get into. But suffice to say, I'm glad that you found the help you needed and that it was the right help at that juncture was integrated care. Last comment on that. All the research we have, all of it, if you boil it down, what do I need? Therapy or medication? The evidence is, well, people are different, so it's not one size fits all, but the evidence is when medication is needed, it tends to work better when you combine it with therapy. And it tends to work even better if you combine it with lifestyle adjustments, which involves learning and sort of making changes. All right. So you went in and saw a therapist, the grief counselor. They connected you to the nurse practitioner who then started you on treatment. Tell us about your experience with that portion of your journey.
It worked very well. I will say I had to cut all of my pills in half because the medication that I was taking was around $300 a month after discounts. So it was the same if it was the double amount versus half. And so I'd have to cut them in half, making it about $150 a month. Luckily, I had done well in the position that I was in at the time. And so I had $150 per month, so $300 every other month that I could spare for that. But if I was in that situation in college, that might have been different. Or before I had gotten my second job out of school, if I was still in my first job, there would have been no way for me to pay for it. It would have been very difficult for me to be able to afford that. So that's another piece there, right? In that iron triangle isn't just access and quality, but also cost. I was really happy with the antidepressant medication that I had received because it did help me get closer to that 100%. It allowed me to be able to cope more easily. I could get through my workday, which I had a pretty stressful job at the time. So I was able to get through that a lot easier. And it paired really well with the grief counseling that I was getting because it allowed me to be more receptive to what he was recommending, or allowed me to be more open about what I was experiencing, how I was feeling. So it was really helpful. I was adamant on not wanting to stay on an antidepressant despite the fact that it was clear that, I'd been experiencing depression on and off, either mild or moderate, my entire life. So after getting on that, I believe it was April of 2020 that I had gotten on it. I finally weaned off of it in November of 2022. So I was on it for quite some time, but I got off of that, and that was around the time where I was getting onto an ADHD medication. So the journey getting on the ADHD medication, or even the journey of getting diagnosed with ADHD, was significantly harder than getting the depression diagnosis or getting the anxiety diagnosis. It wasn't something that I brought up when I was in grief counseling. It wasn't something that I was focused on at all. I was more focused about surviving through the day, dealing with my depression and anxiety. But it was very expensive to get tested. It took a very long time to find a provider that would work for me, that would accept my insurance. I think I ended up not even finding one that was available in the next 6 months that was within my network. So I think I ended up paying completely out of pocket. So that wasn't ideal. Then I moved out of state and I had to get a diagnosis again. Don't ask me why, I don't know. But then I was given a medication called Kelbry, and that made me extremely sick because it interacted negatively with another one of my medications. So I got off of that, and then I got on methylphenidate, which I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I think it's the active ingredient in like Ritalin and
Yeah,
Concerta. Is that correct?
that's
Yeah.
correct.
So that made me very sick, not in the same way that the Kelbry did. The Kelbry was messing with my blood serum, but the methylphenidate, number one, didn't work that well. And number two, would make me very nauseous for about an hour every day. And if you're working 50 plus hours, that's not really going to work. So I eventually was prescribed Vyvanse, and that was with my first psychiatrist. The ones previously given to me by my PCP. So when I got to Vyvanse, it was like day and night. It was like someone had finally turned on my headlights in my car while I was driving at night. All of a sudden, everything was quiet in my brain, or a lot more quiet than it was before. I was able to not interrupt people while we were in the middle of a conversation so that I wouldn't forget what I was going to say. I was able to stay on task. I was able to stay calm, was much better at being proactive and preparing things instead of being reactive, which again really eased my anxiety. I will say I was given a very low dose anxiety medication along with my Vyvanse. It's a buspirone. That was just because I had been told that when you take Vyvanse, sometimes the stimulant piece of it can make your anxiety worse. And I would say that it definitely fanned the flame a bit, so that was beneficial. But I had to increase my anxiety medication after I lost one of my best friends to suicide. That was both an increase in dosage as well as an increase in frequency. I also went back to the same grief counselor that I had seen previously that had helped me cope from yet another loss of a loved one. So that was something that I was really thankful that he was still within network, even though I had switched jobs by the time that I needed to see him again. So that was the journey getting with the anxiety medication. So now I'm just on two medications. I think I'm probably going to stick with these. If I ever need to take anything else, I'm happy to do that. I'm not afraid to switch things up or even get on something in the way that I used to be.
You know, your story speaks of such remarkable resilience. I'm sorry to hear about the death of yet another loved one, close loved one.
Thank you.
Yeah. Losing one person is bad enough. Losing your brother, losing another friend. Yeah. Uh, but also, I also want to highlight the persistence, the fact that you just kind of, I mean, to move across state lines and to find the right providers and to just stick with the process. I don't think people are aware of how hard that is to do that. And then to do the dance with insurance and what people accept. Yeah.
I will say I would say I'm not the average person when it comes to being an insured individual because I have experience in the health insurance realm from a previous position, because I have the knowledge from getting a bachelor's of health science and emphasizing in leadership and policy. One of the classes was a health insurance in the United States class. So I luckily able to be my own advocate, but most are not. Most people don't have the background of selling health insurance and having the education where you're taking health insurance classes at a bachelor's level. I would say I'm very lucky in that. And you're talking about for the persistence, and I didn't have that when I was 19. I neither had the experience nor the education, and I did not stick with it. So, I mean, really that comes to be that piece of, saying it's remarkable or impressive. A lot of that does come from the fact that I just so happen to have a very specific background that makes
Absolutely.
it easier for me to navigate and push through when it comes to insurance and navigating that world.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm glad you found help that worked for you. I'm glad you persisted. You found that within yourself somewhere to persist. And I should also make two comments with respect to that. The first is that my background also is in health policy, and I've also worked in health insurance for several years on the actually been in the health insurance business, if you will. And it's an N of one health plan. You've seen one health plan, you've seen one health plan of the hundreds, maybe thousands that
Yep.
exist. So from an advocacy standpoint, I think a lot of the work that has to be done is to simplify access. Some things like standardizing insurance coverage, what is covered, and you see that reflected in a lot of the efforts that have been made at the national level over the last 20 years. Parity, cover mental health benefits, outpatient treatment, particularly the same way you cover physical health benefits. Eliminate the coverage gap, what used to be called the donut hole
Right.
in benefits, cover prescription, cover all kinds of treatment. And that's the work that's ongoing. And then you have the access issue, which is if you don't have health insurance, then you are really, as you mentioned with your experience, then getting help is really very difficult. Although I will say that many systems, I've worked in 12 or 13 states now. Every system has some version of free coverage, but it's not equivalent across the country.
Mhm.
So a lot of work to be done in that respect, a lot more work to be done. Okay, so in spite of all the losses you've endured, in spite of the fact that you've had to navigate your way through dealing with pretty significant mental health symptom challenges, you have built. I mean, I've seen your resume. It's pretty impressive. I mean, all the things you've done. Just talk about some of the things you've accomplished so far. And I happen to know that you are the top of your class in your current program, and You have things lined up after this, which are also pretty impressive. So just sort of walk us through that aspect of your journey.
Sure, and I will say, I don't know what the rankings are, so I can't I can't say I'm at the top of my class. I can say I'm doing really well with my grades. Uh, I can at least say that. Yeah, so after I graduated, I worked for an electronic health records company. I was traveling as a consultant for a bit, and then I was working as an applications analyst for a bit. So, assisting clinicians or administrators, mostly nurses, to optimize their workflows in the EHR system they had purchased from the organization. Then I spent about, I want to say, 3 years in the health insurance realm where I got to learn about the big and beautiful Medicare, specifically in the Medicare supplement realm and in ancillary products. So, working as an independent insurance broker. Then I was able to be a sales training manager at that brokerage, which was really fun. I worked as a technology recruiter for, I believe, 2.5 years. That was also very fun. Both of those, sales, recruitment, whatever it is, you have to really know your product and you have to really know people. And I love talking to people. I would consider myself a pretty outgoing and friendly person. I also love to learn. So those are the kind of roles that you can flourish in when you have those two sort of traits. Then after I had been a technology recruiter and learned a whole host of things from learning about Java development or greenfield environments, learning about application programming interfaces. I know a little bit about a lot of things. So, not a generalist necessarily, definitely not a specialist. So, I can at least talk to people about those sort of things. But if you were to ever ask me to write, a JavaScript code, even a single line, I probably would break your computer. But I decided that I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to get into healthcare administration. It was something I, to be frank, always wanted to do. But when it came to thinking about applying or thinking about going straight through, I had a great deal of self doubt. When I was in high school, I took a whole host of AP advanced placement classes. I tried my best. I was a cheerleader. I worked as a front desk girl at a dry cleaners. I would go to the cheer gym for a few hours a week. So I was a pretty busy person, but I worked really hard. And I began to realize around the time that I was in high school that I was working harder than other people and still getting the same results. That's not to say I was a harder worker. It was I shouldn't have been having to work as hard. I had learned about dyslexia, but the way dyslexia was described to me is that you might put a letter not in the right sequence, or you might have difficulty reading the words in the correct sequence. I wasn't having those issues, so I didn't think I had a learning disability because what I knew was that it was dyslexia. That's the learning disability that I knew about. It wasn't until I described to someone that I think I said, "Isn't it so annoying that you can read a whole paragraph of something and not understand any of it?" And they said to me, "What do you mean?" And I'm like, well, sometimes I have to read a paragraph or a sentence 3 or 4 times in order for me to actually understand what they're talking about. And this is a close friend of mine, and they laughed and they were like, "I don't know what you mean." The only time that happens to me is when I'm not paying attention. So I thought, oh my God, I'm stupid. I did not realize this. Everyone has been telling me my entire life, or at least my mom, that I'm smart. And I just found out that I'm actually not. What is going on here? I had a little bit of a crisis there. What do you mean that when you read these words in this sentence, when you read these sentences in this paragraph, you know what the words are saying? I was
Mhm.
very fearful that I was just dumb. And so I was working a lot harder than I needed to. And once I finally got that ADHD diagnosis and finally got on the correct medication, there was a bit of a sadness that kind of rushed over me of why have I been.
Suffering.
Yeah, it's like trying to drive a car that has square wheels. Like,
Yeah.
how much different would my life be right
Yeah.
now if I had been diagnosed earlier and been put on proper medication earlier?
And that again makes the point of what this is about. What this whole podcast is about is help does work. It does work when it's accessed timely, when it's the right kind of help. That is, it's meets your needs. It's not sort of cookie cutter treatment, but where it's also, I think, sustained over time, which is the other piece of this, and where stigma is not a barrier to getting help, which unfortunately is all too often the case. Some of the ways stigma shows up, family members don't want their loved ones on medication, even though the medications would make a difference. You said it earlier, it could be day and night. It's like, where has this been all my life? Suddenly, the world makes sense, everything falls into place, I can get things done. And that's the case with more people than I can say. So you've done a lot in your career. You've been a student, you've been a salesperson, you've been a trainer, you've been in tech, you've sold Medicare, health insurance, and now you're back in school. I also happen to know you're very, very much a people person. You care deeply about your friends, you maintain a very tight network of relationships, and you're there for people. What have you learned from your journey that you'd like to pass along to our listeners as a few closing thoughts, lessons learned?
Sure. The first thing I would say is your path does not need to be linear in order for you to be successful. My path has certainly not been linear, but I have been successful and hope to continue to be successful. Your life doesn't need to be flashy in order for it to be beautiful. My biggest recommendation is to say yes more, to stay curious, to keep a growth oriented mindset, and overall be kind, not just to others, but to yourself as well.
And I think that's a perfect closing note. Thank you again, Veronica, for being here with us. Thank you for your courage, sharing your story and what have been some very difficult moments, but also for inspiring us with your honesty and your resilience, and wishing you all success in your future endeavors.
You're too kind. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to get on here and talk about my personal story.